CounterPoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. Canada's battle over streaming regulation and so-called CanCon rules is escalating once again. The CRTC has announced that large online streaming platforms, including services like Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime Video, and Spotify, will now be required to contribute 15% of their Canadian revenues towards Canadian content production and broadcasting initiatives. So that triples the original 5% requirement introduced under the Online Streaming Act. Supporters of the policy argue the move is necessary to protect Canadian culture and ensure domestic creators can compete in an increasingly global digital marketplace. The CRTC, however, says that the new framework will help stabilize billions of dollars in annual support for Canadian and Indigenous programming, including French language content and local news. But critics warn Canadians themselves could end up footing the bill through higher subscription prices, reduced platform investment, and fewer content choices. Opponents also argue that the government is attempting to extend outdated broadcasting rules into a modern streaming era, giving the federal regulators, in fact, greater influence over what Canadians watch, promote, and discover online. Major streaming companies are already challenging earlier versions of this policy in court, while the United States has raised concerns that the Online Streaming Act unfairly targets American firms ahead of trade negotiations. The broader debate touches on culture, consumer costs, government regulation, and the future of digital freedom in Canada. So should Ottawa be forcing global streaming companies to subsidize Canadian content? Or should Canadians themselves decide what succeeds in the marketplace? Well, joining me now to discuss this is David Clement, Policy Director with the Consumer Choice Centre. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, this is always a very spicy topic because, as you will probably share, Canadians are huge consumers of online streaming. So let's start with the CRTC. Maybe give us just a little bit of history. When was the Online Streaming Act brought in, and what was it hoping to achieve with this 5% tax, if you will?
Yeah, so the 5% tax, we're looking at 2024 when that was brought in. The whole purpose of it was to fund Canadian content, or as they say, protect Canadian culture. But my open question to the CRTC and to policymakers in Ottawa is, who are they protecting Canadian culture from? Because at the end of the day, if Canadian content isn't being well received by Canadian consumers, that's not some sort of market failure. That's market feedback, and that's a good thing. That means that consumers are protesting or choosing with their wallets what they want to consume. And when it comes to Canadian culture, this is what's always made me scratch my head. We already have a very expensive vehicle for protecting Canadian culture. It's called the CBC. And so we fund, as taxpayers, upwards of $1 billion, more now, to protect Canadian culture and incubate whatever it is that means. But now we're going to also have to subsidize it as consumers in the private sector, despite the fact that we already do it with our tax dollars. And so there are a lot of open and looming questions as to why the Online Streaming Act even needs to exist in today's ecosystem.
And you bring up some fair points, both that, yes, the CBC exists and, produces some excellent content, but, we pay for it through tax dollars, and a very good point. So when folks refer to this as a streaming tax, is that accurate description? And ultimately, will consumers be footing the bill for this?
Yeah, so I think calling it a streaming tax is accurate. I mean, it's a fee the government is imposing on a company, and those types of fees are almost always passed down onto consumers through higher prices. That obviously will take time. We'll see how this shakes out. It's also being challenged. So I think in the long run, if things stand, it will almost certainly increase costs for Canadians because that tripling of the fee has to be recovered somehow. It's very unlikely that a Netflix or Spotify is just going to eat the loss and not pass some of that on. But we'll really wait and see, because the Trump administration has put this policy on the forefront of their grievances against Canada in terms of the upcoming USMCA renegotiation. So there is still time for it to be repealed.
Absolutely, and we anticipate those negotiations will be somewhat tense. So let's see what the benefit or con will be to this streaming tax. Anyhow, we're going to pick up this discussion in just a few minutes when we return. Welcome back. I'm joined by David Clement, Policy Director at the Consumers Choice Center, as we discuss streaming tax. What is it, and why is it being tripled, or it's being proposed to be tripled to secure Canadian content? Well, again, joining me is David Clement. We're going to discuss all that. David, so getting back to this streaming tax, as it's called, to go from 5 to 15% is quite a jump. I appreciate that the USMCA negotiations are coming up. You know, maybe there will be some wiggle room with that 15% number. Maybe it'll be completely eradicated. But as the operators are dealing with Canada, we're talking about the Disney Pluses, Amazon Prime, Netflix, that sort of thing. They're probably proceeding as this is going forward, hope barring any interventions from the US government. We'll see. I'm sure they're lobbying them heavily. But what would an impact on Canadian consumption of online streaming look like? Like, what could they possibly do if they don't want to pay this tax, or if they're saying, you know what, this is too costly here in Canada? What would some of the repercussions look like?
Yeah, so increased prices in the long run. You could potentially see smaller outfits um, leave Canada or not enter Canada. So creating a less competitive marketplace, because the barrier to entry just got 3 times higher than it otherwise was. And so it's really hard to forecast what the big players are going to do. But in terms of the smaller um, outfits and potentially new ones, right? There are new streaming platforms for all sorts of different types of content that come up any given day. I mean, if you look at the sports sector specifically, I mean, there are almost countless different apps that you can use to watch everything from cricket in India to English Premier League soccer to professional rugby. Um, how do the regulations apply to uh, potentially cultural content outside of the big players is unclear. There's a revenue threshold, but once they hit that revenue threshold, is it going to be worth it to stay when your Canadian cultural content tax goes from 5 to 15%? That is still an open question.
Right, right. And I suspect there would be a caveat for smaller players, because this seems to me, at least in my uneducated opinion, as they're going after the big guys because they're the ones with the deep
Mhm.
pockets, and Canadian content needs to be funded. So let's play like in their defense. So you know, current Canadian broadcasters, we pay into the Canadian content. So why should online streamers be exempt? If they're benefiting and they're profiting from Canadian audiences, why shouldn't they be equally investing, like television productions, in Canadian content?
I mean, that's a good question. The answer to that would be it's never been easier to manually put up Canadian content online. And so, what I call this is the CRTC applying Shania Twain era regulations on new and innovative platforms. And what I mean by that is, in order for Shania Twain to essentially reinvent country music and be one of the biggest superstars on the planet, she had to go through demo reels and producer meetings and everything that was required of someone decades ago. So the barriers to entry for a Canadian were quite high.
Right.
The barrier the barrier to entries in music, if we use that as an example, is simply the ability to upload an MP3.
Which is
It's
what
about as low
Justin
as it
Bieber did, right? That's what catapulted him to
Justin Bieber
superstardom.
becomes one of the highest grossing artists of all time. How did he get there? Uploading videos to YouTube. So the idea that Canadian cultural content or music in this example is going to be crowded out in a global ecosystem just doesn't map or track with the reality of how easy it is now in today's age to put content out there, right? It's incredibly easy to record, edit, and launch your own music on Spotify or
Right.
put it on YouTube or any of the other platforms, and make a run at it. It didn't used to be that way. And so I could hypothetically understand the argument for trying to protect Canadian culture or incubate it with rules and regulations that kind of tilt the scales when the barriers to entry were so high. The barriers to entry are so incredibly low today that we're essentially applying that old 80s style process, again with music as the example, when the industry and consumers have moved on. And
Oh.
the CRTC and Ottawa have really failed to recognize that.
Yeah, so it sounds to me that there's an archaic kind of template being used and we haven't moved on to the new millennia. Okay, we're going to
Mhm.
continue this discussion in just a few moments when we return. Welcome back. We're discussing the Online Streaming Act and the CRTC and the recent announcement that they're seeking to increase the Canadian content or streaming tax to 15% up from 5. That could have huge impacts on what you, the viewer, can access, if you can access these platforms at all going forward. Joining me again is David Clement. David, so let's talk about the CRTC because they're the big player here. They're setting the standards. They've been around for a long time and they're the regulator. So
Mhm.
when it comes to the authority of the CRTC, how much authority ought they have over online platforms in the first place? Are we, again, we talked about this in the previous segment, are we seeing like an outdated model being imposed in a modern world?
Yeah, I would argue that we are, because again, we're talking about laws and legislation and regulations that were written 3, 4 decades ago and trying to map that over the digital ecosystem, which is creating such a mess. But my criticism for the CRTC right now, so Scott Shortliff, the head of the CRTC, was questioned about why would they announce this in the lead up to trade negotiations with the U.S., knowing that Jamieson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, has flagged this exact policy as a grievance. Why would they go ahead and triple it? And he said, well, we don't converse with government on these types of decisions. And so what we have here is an unelected regulator essentially gumming up the process of renegotiating our most important trade relationship and the importance of the USMCA, and trying to pretend as if because they're at arm's length from legislators in Ottawa that the consequences aren't going to be devastating. And so that is my most irritating aspect of this from the CRTC, is that they don't live in a bubble. They know what the grievances from the Trump
Hmm.
administration are, and yet they went forward with this anyway, knowing that the original 5% was a problem, and now we've tripled it to 15%. And what would happen if the United States responded in kind with some sort of retaliatory tariff, right? Or some retaliatory restriction? The US is the biggest consumer market for entertainment in the world, and Canadian content creators would be shut out of that market, or at least have a higher barrier to entry. And so you would be eliminating the opportunity for the Justin Biebers or the Drakes of the world who have gone out and become sensations and world icons on their own accord. If the Trump administration wants to retaliate in the same digital space, that would spell a world of trouble for Canadians who produce music or television, etc., who want access to the biggest market in the world. And so, for me, to use a baseball reference, it's just an incredible unforced error on behalf of the CRTC here, and it couldn't come at a worse time.
No, okay, on paper, I 100% agree with you. I think it looks like an unforced error based on what they're saying. Who knows what the the real angle is? Maybe this is going to be the bargaining chip in I don't know, protecting dairy supply management. Who knows what's happening behind the scenes? Because we only know what's being told. But you're right. The CRTC said that we have to take them at their word. Um, and I don't know. Canadians are so overwhelmed. Are we now setting ourselves up with these USMCA negotiations with throwing this oil on the fire that we're going to be having more of a tariff war yet again? I think we're so sick of that. Um, and again, you mentioned the US has raised concerns over this tax. Why poke them in the eye? What's the benefit? I mean, I wish I could be a fly in the wall in the PMO. I don't know.
It leaves me wondering, do we want the USMCA renegotiation to fail? And at this point, I think that's a serious question, because the Carney government has taken very proactive steps to eliminate some of these grievances, the digital services tax and things like that. That's fantastic. But at the same time, implemented policies that we know the Trump administration and even the Biden administration, right? It's not actually a partisan
Right.
problem. This isn't an instance where Trump has some warped view on Canada and how the Canadian economy works or anything like that. These are grievances going back to the Biden administration.
Yes. Yes.
So they are bipartisan in American opposition. And so when we have a situation like this with the CRTC, so either, I mean, the prime minister could come out right now and say, okay, we're not going to do this, or we're going to get rid of the online streaming act. And that would be a huge win both for trade and for Canadian consumers.
Hmm.
But we haven't had that yet. And without that, it just begs the question of why are we undercutting ourselves in the lead up to negotiations?
True. Very good point. These are excellent points, and we're going to tackle them when we return after this commercial break. Welcome back to CounterPoint. We're discussing the Online Streaming Act and the recent announcement that the tax, the streaming tax, which is a levy they give to these US companies or any company for that matter operating in Canada, online streaming, that they're tripling that levy to 15%. So what does that mean for Americans? What does it mean for Canadians? What does it mean for USMCA negotiations, which we're on the precipice for? And joining me again is David Clement. So, David, just to tie up the American angle in all this, a lot of these big companies are American based companies. Do you think Americans or the Trump administration view this as like a shot at their companies?
Yeah, I think it's viewed as a shot at their economic engine, in the same way that Trump tariffs on Albertan oil would be seen as a direct shot at the Canadian economy. The tech sector in the United States is the largest in the world, and just as we have defended Canadian oil and gas and the ability to export that to international markets, the same would apply to the U.S. For the digital economy. And so,
Hmm.
I mean, we can't be surprised that this matters to the Americans, and we can't be surprised because it's mattered to both Republican and Democrat administrations.
Right, right. Now, some will say, well, I'm sure there are other jurisdictions in the world that have a tax like this. Canada is not this lone, ranger in this field. What other countries have something similar?
Yeah, so I mean, some other countries do. Countries like Switzerland or France or Spain and other markets will have a similar tax, but it will be exponentially less. We're looking at between 1% and 4%, depending on the
Oh,
country. Some supporters will say, well, the EU has a requirement that at least 30% of the catalog for a streamer has to be European works. But that's incredibly easy to accommodate based on existing productions because the EU has 27 member states and
right.
so many different languages, right? So there's a buffet of European options and European movie titles or TV shows or music that can be plug and played into a platform to comply with that. It's a different game in Canada when we're talking about two languages and a population that is significantly smaller. And so to try and tilt the scales in the same way fails to recognize the ease in which that can be applied in the EU and how that doesn't track or replicate very easily in Canada.
Okay, so for the artists who might be concerned about how to be competitive in this global market without this tax, uh, what advice would you give them? Is there a better way for them to, again, remain competitive without imposing these kinds of regulatory taxes?
Well, the tax doesn't guarantee that anybody listens or watches this Canadian content. And the wording of the Online Streaming Act actually explicitly says this. It says, what you watch will always be up to you. And so for me, that should have ended the debate because if we trust Canadian consumers to make that call for themselves, well, then why are we intervening to try and make that call for them? What we could have is a scenario where these streaming platforms have to pump money into productions that nobody's going to watch, into music that nobody's going to listen to, um, and so for artists, the idea that this potential tax saves them is really just, uh, for me, I think rather foolish, because there is no guarantee that what they produce is popular, just by virtue of being Canadian. It might guarantee that it gets created, but it doesn't guarantee that it gets watched. It doesn't
Right.
guarantee that it gets listened to. And we have a mechanism to know what is popular, and that's what consumers want. And the ecosystem that we have right now generally does a pretty good job of parsing out the winners and losers in terms of what Canadians want to listen to and watch.
Okay, last 20 seconds. Looking ahead with this debate over like greater digital regulation in Canada, are we moving towards more choice or more government control, in your opinion?
Unfortunately, more government control. Hopefully, the Online Streaming Act is one of the things on the chopping block in USMCA renegotiation.
Okay, well, we'll have to keep a close eye on that. David, thank you again for being with us today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to suggest a topic for the show, feel free to reach out via X at Granic Allen or via the News Forum website. This has been CounterPoint. Thanks for watching.